Hey everyone, it's Will, GamerDad, with another video for you. So in today's Back to Basics video, I've had a lot of people ask about team comps, how I think about and design different teams, and just kind of put together the rosters that I do have right now. And so in this video, I just wanted to kind of go over some thoughts and considerations when building a team. Now, if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate it. I also do have a Patreon account for those who want to support me this way. So first off, I'd like to say that I did make a previous video about team comps that is also in my Back to Basics channel and playlist. So the link will be below. And this second video is more meant to further expand on some of those strategies. Keep in mind that that video is also a lot older, and since then we've had a lot more access to different things like zones, grasses, and things like that. Now remember that there is no universal best team or best unit for every situation, despite what you may see in other guides or tier lists. Also remember that gacha units do not always mean that they are better units. You should also always treat them equally to free-to-play units and then evaluate your need and the use of them based on what you want to accomplish on your team and what roles that you need filled. For example, Aldo at max light is still very, very viable as your top main DPS in Fire Slash teams. Also, we are only discussing team building, just the units. So you are still required to get all the applicable gear and grasta to maximize your team's usefulness. And this applies especially to personal manifest weapons, since they actually further enhance the base abilities of those units. Remember that when you're designing a team for a specific purpose, you may also consider researching the potential mobs and boss fights you're planning to take on so that you can properly build the right team for the situation. Or, during the fights, you can bring a random mixed team with mixed weapons and elemental types, and then you can press status on the enemies to learn what you're up against. No one specific unit is ever required for a fight, however, many of them will make life easier for you. And finally, keep in mind that these are tips and strategies are only meant as a general guide. I am obviously not the best AE player on the planet. I use strategies that I've kind of learned along the ways, and they hopefully have been helping you in your journey through Another Eden as well. So once you get the hang of team building and kind of customizing, you can start to optimize your team for better results. That is either low turn clears or just faster runs through dungeons. You might have heard of things like the 1-1-1 strategy, where your one unit does just one move, saving time as you run through the dungeon. Alright, so without any further ado, I'm just going to cover first my thoughts about team comps for Overworld or dungeon farming. So obviously this particular party 6, is the one I use for Kirio's dungeon. Remember that if you are using any dungeon that is a red key in this case, and this is my red key dungeon, you definitely have to bring the unit that you're grinding the light or shadow for. Otherwise, you really are missing out on one of the main benefits of running those keys, not only the chance, treatises, and codexes and opuses. You just want to have light or shadow on your applicable character. Honestly speaking, I'm not going to spend too much time on this kind of dungeon comp. Realistically speaking, what you only need is enough DPS to clear through the mobs. There are ways to make things easier, as in you can equip things like encounter downs, which would make less encounters applicable, but the same rule applies. You really want to bring lots of DPS if you are in the early to mid game where you actually do take a lot of damage. You probably need a healer. However, if you've gotten any of the newer units on your team, such as, for example, some of the more powerful 0 MP casters, such as AS Tsubame, Cyan Scyther, AS Kikyo, the list goes on and on. Or Flam, for example, Flam Lapis, or Flamelapis, these units are going to make your life very easy, and you probably won't be running into too much problem with the overworld or even in dungeon clearing. In my case, if you wanted me just to slowly and briefly explain why I have this team in place, Iya Sukiya is one of the few units that actually do a preemptive pain status on each enemy fight, whether or not it's a mob or boss. And by doing that, I can maximize my paying Grasta such that they're going to do a lot of damage. And of course, you can use my AoE attacks. Kid, Eva, and Clark will all do the trick. Remember what I said earlier about researching the mobs and bosses you are encountering in that particular dungeon, and they generally clear that very, very easily. Keep in mind that at some point in the future, obviously if you're in the early and mid game and don't have a lot of access to Grasta, damage might still be a little bit difficult, in which case you can use multiple units with AoE attacks to clear, and that's really not a problem. I mean, if you need 2 AoEs, as long as you try to avoid as many fights as possible or just walk through normally, you should have enough MP to make it to the end, and with 4 full units and possibly your backup units in the back, you can just rotate them up and clear that dungeon. Also, by the time you're in the end game where your AoEs are doing significant damage, or if you have some of the more recent gacha units where they do a ton of damage, with the Grasta system, unless the mobs or the boss absorbs, that is, you cannot damage it at all, even resisted damage is usually not a problem, given the fact that you can bring different elements or units to your team. Now, one of the reasons I brought a team like this also, if you notice, I actually have different weapon types and different sources of elemental damage, so that if I don't have to think about it, it will make life easy for me. For example, I have a slash, but it's also fire. I've got a pierce, but it's also wind. I've got 2 magic users. They each do crystal, but one does earth and one does water. So we have a lot of mixed elements and weapon types as required. And again, if I ran into a big problem where I just cannot overcome those, I will just, check the status on those enemies or bosses, and I'll just change, make a minor tweak to the dungeon team and have that clear. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of how I build the team. And of course, like I said, the Grasta's usefulness and how to get Grasta and what they do, I have that covered in another Back to Basics video, which is the Grasta video up to 2.8.5. Make sure you check that out, which I'll also link in the description below. Again, one last thing I'll say about Overworld dungeons. Again, this is my green key dungeon, so I'm currently grinding Antiquity Guerrilla, and same idea here. We have the guaranteed pain setter Sukiya. Keep in mind that if you have a poison-based Grasta system, you can use, I believe, ES Iska sets preemptive poison. You also have a 0 MP attack from Tsubame, and keep in mind, we still have Eva, which does a ton of damage. Garyu is the one to be grinded out. And we have Straw Boy carrying Grasta for Tsubame, and Mario carrying Grasta for Eva. So again, if you're relatively new to the game and you don't understand what that means by carrying, when units share the same exact weapon type, they can start sharing Grasta, which shares the ability. Again, this is covered in another video, but I just quickly show you. And that's how you really enhance the damage for the rest of the team. Note that the second portion of this says damage when at max HP for party member that meets requirements. And this is exactly how some of the teams and even end game boss comps do a ton of damage, and you see unrelated units sitting in the back. They're usually the same weapon type as some of your top line units in the front, and they help enhance it by carrying Grasta even though they're not doing any fighting themselves. All right, so hopefully that covers your Overworld. And again, I won't spend too much time on it because realistically, I hopefully you'll have no trouble with Overworld content. Now, again, at this point, I'm just going to cover some of my thoughts about building, certain teams to fight endgame content. That is, tough fights, either manifest, super bosses, and so on and so forth. And I'll cover 2 of my, I'll cover 2, and if there's enough time, I'll cover 3 of my more useful or more used teams recently. And I'll give you some of my thoughts as to why I put it a certain way. So this is obviously called my wins team. I know that's kind of just funny. And you can see that we have almost all win units here. And we have someone that stands out a little bit as well. We have Renri here in the back. So when it comes to building any sort of super boss or endgame boss fight content, the things I consider are that you need to fill roles on are you need a zone setter. If not 1, you need 2. And the reason for that is that in order to maximize your damage, you usually are building or looking into building what they call synergy. That is, all the units can kind of work with each other to bring out the maximum of each of their abilities. And obviously, there are two ways to tie it down in zone to make them better. You can either have an elemental zone where they're all one element, or you can have a weapon type zone where they all do one type of weapon type attack. Again, and not only that, there's benefits to having a zone team. The AF bar charges faster, you do more damage, it reduces damage by opposite weapon types or opposite elements, and it's really, really good. And there's very few endgame fights where you're not using a zone team. So I would highly recommend that zone type units and zone teams are kind of like what you're aiming for once you get to the end game. Whether or not you're early or late end game, you're pretty much using those. So you first off have to start with one, if not two zone setters. And if you need a second zone setter, it's only because you know that this fight can cancel your zone, and some fights can do that, in which case you use your second zone setter to kind of VC in or switch from the back to the front and reestablish that zone. Now, you can overcome that, of course, with locking it in with another zone. So that is another mechanic that's obviously more for the end game user. Not only do you need at least one zone setter, you need at least one dual debuffer and or defensive support generally. Now, there are exceptions to that, and we'll cover that shortly, but defensive supports are things like Nikoko. There are many other examples. They are people who do dual shielding, they can do healing, they can do one, if not both, debuffs. That means you're reducing the effectiveness of the enemy's attacks with power and int or speed, and you can control the game that way. So I would say that would be what I look for after my zone setter. And finally, I'm looking for potentially one offensive support, if not more. And keep in mind that some units can actually do more than one role, and that's why certain units are much more valuable than others. For example, Nikoko is not only a defensive type unit that can heal and shield and all that. She can do respectable damage. She can actually do, and when I'll show you what I mean by her moves. And so some people may not be useful to that. Like the cat hook does tons of damage. This one is the shielding one, which she can do. The cat hook also does healing, which also attacks. The cat deity also does attacks, increases crit damage, and increases combo rate. So again, if you're doing AFs, which almost everyone does, that will help you do more damage during the AF by increasing the combo percent meter. And so Nikoko fits both roles as a defensive as well as an offensive support. Other things you're looking for in offensive support is usually things like increased crit damage, decreased physical debuff resistance, or increased crit rate, for example, increased type damage. These are all things that would be traits you're looking for on an offensive support, as opposed to the defensive support, which is more like shielding, mitigation, barriers, and healing. Keep in mind that someone like AS Kiko, as much as she's going to be your main line DPS, don't discount the fact that she is a high-end offensive support unit. Remember that she does slash resistance and crit down up to 70%, and crit damage up to 70% as well, depending on whether or not you do it in overdrive or not. So she not only helps to help everyone who does slash attacks more damage, she gives everyone crit damage up, which helps all of your team members do more damage. And finally, like I said, after your zone setter, defensive support, offensive support, now we always talk about DPS as well, and you'll need one for sure. Because the problem is that if you don't have enough DPS, you're going to lose the fight by either not doing enough damage or just, you'll run out of time. Okay? One thing I didn't mention here, if you're wondering what Melissa does, she is our offensive support, mainly because of her benefits like Nephrite Boost, which increases crit damage of all party member by 30%. She can use Ruin Genocide, which can inflict Break. Break does double damage. She can do Glint Gale, and even though it doesn't do a lot of damage, it reduces wind and crystal resistance by 50% and physical resistance as well. Also increases type attack for all party members. So, and keep in mind that she's also a Flash Strike Zone setter, which also helps with boosting your team. And so in this team here, you have obviously one zone setter with Suzette. you have Flash Strike Zone Setter with Melissa. Then you have defensive support with Nokoko, offensive support with Melissa, Nokoko, and somewhat Kikyo. And your main DPS is Kikyo and Suzette. Now, in terms of Renri, she is our Grasta carrier, and so we want to make sure we carry the Grasta. She is an axe user. She can carry the max HP axe. She can carry Gale axe, and in some cases, she would carry Sweet Tooth as well, because Cyan Scyther as well as True Manifestors have the trait Sweet Tooth, which you can see here. And so this is what I mean by designing a certain team to kind of fit in. And so these are all the aspects you're talking about when building a team for that. And then after that, so you have everything you need. You just bring it into the fight and kind of see how it performs. If you're not sure how the fight is going, you're going to either win or you lose. And if you lose, you're going to have to see what worked and what didn't work, and you adjust accordingly. For example, if you need more mitigation, you have to might bring another defensive support or modify the existing support unit you have. If you're not if you don't have a healer, then you obviously will modify that as well. So it does take some tinkering. In this case, I left this team the same because this team I consider to be relatively well balanced, and therefore any enemies who are weak to win or vulnerable to win, this team is more than capable of handling, if that makes sense. And I would only adjust the team comp as needed. Now, finally, the Grasta system is, again, you can modify that to your needs, and that won't be covered in this video. So at this point, I know I've been talking a lot. So let me know in the comments below what you think about my thought process so far. I probably missed out on a few things, but I'm hoping that I at least give you some ideas of, like I said, just the general way to kind of construct a team. And obviously, there's going to be more and ways to kind of optimize or just change around the team as well. Now, in our next example, we have our blunt team here, and same thing. So let's just have a little bit of test here and see if you can see what aspects we have covered in this team. So remember, we talked about the first thing. We need at least one zone setter. Okay, so the answer is we have two zone setters here for our blunt team. We have Yifa, which is a blunt zone setter. We have AS Miufa, also a blunt zone setter. So some duplication here, but like I said, that's only because just in case the zone gets reset, or in some cases, having two zone setters, their end of turn benefits also stack. And so I also do that for that reason as well, if you're wondering. Okay, how about our defensive support? So remember, we're looking for someone like a dual debuffer. We're also looking for a healer, shielder, damage mitigation, and so on and so forth. All right, so I know some of you don't know all the units and what they do. So again, you'd have to actually use the AE Wiki or even some of my 5-star review videos to kind of learn more about each unit. And that's one thing I will definitely say. As you're getting more used to the game, as you play through the game and get more and more roster units, make sure you keep up with what each unit does, because if you don't, you won't be able to best utilize them. And remember that each unit has like almost 10 moves. You can kind of customize which moves you want to use. Obviously, most people use the 2 5-star moves, and then you would customize your third, or if you have enough light and shadow, your fourth move into your move set as needed. For example, Tsubami's third move, we use her 2 5-star moves in Ningi Gansai as well as Chana Boyoya. I can customize by even using Battle Meridian, which helps speed her up. Or if I want to boost my Earth team, I can actually use this to boost the Earth type attacks of all party members by 30%. And so in this case, we are using a mixed team with mixed elements. So I decided to use the speed up more so than, and the power up with Battle Meridian more so than her other move. But again, if you put her into your Earth team or Earth Blunt team, different elemental zones, you can change up that move to customize as needed. So anyways, our dual debuffer / defensive support would be covered by the multiple cover units here. So first of all, dual debuffing. We have a 35-35 dual debuff of power and int by Tsubame. How about healing? We actually have HP heal from Melina. When she attacks, she actually heals. We also have MP regeneration from Miumfa. We also have end of turn barrier, shielding, damage mitigation while in blunt zone with AS Miumfa as well. And we also have Pride to tank out anything with his 6-pack, super hot sermons. So we have all those as our defenses as needed. Keep in mind that Yifa also is a dual debuffer if needed on top. She also has regen, physical, type shielding, and so on and so forth. Alright, so we covered zones, we covered debuffs. How about offensive support? Okay, so Miyunfa AS, the main reason we use her, if you're wondering now, Tea Kettle Carnival is a broken move. Earth type of all party members plus 30, weapon type damage of all party characters 30, water type resistance plus 30, doubles the effect in blunt zone. So you got some water shielding, which is obviously niche, but look at that. Earth damage, 60, weapon damage, 60, and let's just be honest, I have 2 earth damage on my team, and weapon damage, everyone uses a weapon. So that's what I mean by offensive support. That is some pretty crazy stuff. And of course, the end of turn boost from both Yifa and Miyunfa help with that. And how about crit damage? Melina AS actually with Manifest does have crit damage up. Some people don't realize that because, you know, she's a more recent manifested unit, but that's usually not even bad. Not to mention, don't forget that this kind of benefit here, the water type resistance down 30, blunt resistance down 30, and crit rate guaranteed for 3 moves is an offensive support unit as well. By putting more resistance of blunt attacks on the enemy, your entire blunt team does more damage. And finally, we're talking about our main DPS. Who is our main DPS? The answer is pretty much AS Ubami, AS Miyunfa, and AS Melina. Yifa doesn't do a lot of damage, even in zone. However, those front 3, with the right setups, Grasta, and sharing, are unbelievable for DPS. So you can see that a lot of units actually share abilities, and you would customize if you needed different ones. For example, say the enemy is null or absorbs water attacks. Well, AS Melina wouldn't be in there. We can consider other units. What if the enemy is weak to fire? Then we would use someone like AS Hardy or Hardy as our blunt fire setter, or we can customize with other units such as that. Keep in mind that Pride is a fire type blunt unit, but his DPS is low. And finally, in terms of Grasta holders, because you also do want to consider Grasta holders in your team comps, Yifa being that we know she doesn't do a lot of damage, even though she's mainline, she actually carries a lot of Grasta for your team. And finally, Strawboy also carries a lot of Grasta because she's a fist user, which shares weapon type with AS Tsubame. Eastern and fist. So there you go. So again, just some basic ideas of how to build that out. Remember that if you don't have a dual debuffer, even though you can do a ton of DPS damage, you might actually die the next turn if the fight lasts more than 1 turn. For example, if you can do a 1-turn AF and just win, you don't have to worry about defense or damage. However, if the fight lasts 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 turns, we know a lot of fights have HP stoppers. We also know that Boss Rush, for example, has multiple stages. You will essentially always need a dual debuffer and shielder and healer on your team. And if you watch a lot of my strategies on Boss Rush, with very few exceptions, I have those on my team. All right. So finally, one last thing to cover. This is why I love Magic Zone. I know I should remove her and put someone else in there. I mean, we can use any sort of units in there. So, same thing. Let's do a little bit of test. Who's our zone setters? Do we have any? Pretty much the same thing. We have 2 zone setters, Chio and AS Rosetta. Who is our defensive support? So, shielding, dual debuffs, don't forget healing. Who's covering that? We have AS Dunarith, actually. AS Dunarith has an int down attack on his AoE, right here. And if you're wondering, hey, Will, you don't have a power down on this magic team, not from what I can see. Don't forget you have Starkey now, which does a dual debuff everything. So right here, the Starburst is a nice add, power and int down. How about support in terms of doing more damage? So there's defensive support, which we talked about, the dual debuffing. How about the healer? Now, keep in mind, Dunarith has shielding and healing. AS Rosetta has Codex, which is a healer. Clark can heal. If you really need to, Mario can heal as well, and has shielding. How about offensive support now? you don't need to look any further than our main zone setters. Remember that Horai Jewel is a crazy move that helps everyone do tons and tons of damage. Mental Focus is the main way that magic teams do a ton of damage, and she, as well as AS Rosetta, set Mental Focus on the whole team, which is the magic damage based on max MP value of all party members. Guarantee Crit Rate, which is also offensive support. Sets Pain and Poison, which enhances your Grasta system, and obviously does more effects during certain zones. And Rosetta also does the same thing with her Prayer Judgment, except that it also has a defensive capability of physical resistance plus 30% as well. Don't forget that because a lot of Zone Setter have offensive end of turns, look at that. While in Magic Zone, all strength percentage based on magic attacks. For Rosetta, I believe is 20% per magic move done that turn up to 80%, or the previous turn. And I think Chio's is 15%, and these are reducted, these have diminishing returns, but they basically cap out at almost 100%. So you're talking a lot of defensive and offensive capabilities there. And who's our DPS? Clark can be our Crystal DPS. He can be our Earth DPS. Chio can be our Earth DPS. You've seen her Riku Conquest do a ton of damage. Dunarith under the right circumstances, and he is also an offensive support, increasing staff damage by your whole team by 50%. Right there. And type attack, of course. And so you have lots of sources of damage, and let's just say the enemy is weak to fire. Well, instead of putting Clark, we can put Garyu. If the enemy is weak to water, we can put Eva. We have Levia. We have a lot of support here. We can even use the likes of Nagi if needed for extra crystal damage, Eva. And Miris has effects for Earth. Mighty is obviously for water. So these are things you want to consider, again, when customizing. In this case, I left this team the same because the last fight, I didn't need any water DPS, which is why you don't have it here. And finally, Grasta supports. Mario will do the trick. In this case, she is carrying for water Grasta, but you would customize as needed. And Starkey can carry Grasta because his DPS is not there. In this case, we left some proficiency debuff resistance on there from a previous fight. And again, you would customize that as needed. All right, so hopefully that gives you some idea of how GamerDad fills up his roster and his different teams. And as you understand the different uses of your units and what kind of roles you want each unit to play, it actually will help your summoning game as well. Because what will happen is you'll start to realize that you're missing certain qualities or traits in certain units, in which case you'll be like, okay, if this newer unit that comes out in the gacha system is one that will complement that team, then you will summon for it. For example, say I wanted Flamelopus because I wanted a high-end water magic DPS for my team, then you would summon it. As opposed to, well, what if you had a complete roster already and you come up with the next unit that, although does a lot of damage, you might not need it. Remember, you've already won the most recent fights. Then these are the banners that you would opt to pass on, as difficult as that sounds, in order to save for a future where you absolutely need a unit to help fill a roster need. Anyways, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.